My stepmother walked into my 1-year sober anniversary party with a pill bottle in her purse and never once suspected. My entire family was hiding in the hallway, listening to every single word she said. The door swung open before I even heard her car in the driveway. Vivian never knocked. She never had. Not in 18 years. And she wasn't about to start on the one day that actually belonged to me. She walked into my kitchen in a cream-colored blazer, heels clicking on the tile, and stopped in front of the cake on the counter. 1 year sober, it said. In blue icing, my friend Marcus had piped himself at 11 that morning. She looked at it the way you look at a stain on a shirt you're about to throw out. "Oh, honey," she said, tilting her head. That fake pity tilt. I'd know it anywhere. "You relapsed already? On your own anniversary?" I hadn't touched anything. I hadn't touched anything in 365 days, and she knew it, because she'd been counting too, waiting for a single crack to show up in my voice or my hands. I was just tired. Tired from setting up chairs since 7 in the morning. Tired from 3 years of therapy. Tired in the specific way you get when you've spent your whole adult life being told your exhaustion is actually evidence of guilt. "I'm fine, Vivian," I said. She reached into her purse. I watched her hand move like I was watching it through glass, slow and underwater. The purse was small, quilted, the kind that cost more than my rent, and out of it she pulled an amber pill bottle, no label, and she gave it a little shake so it rattled like a wind chime in the quiet kitchen. "I brought your favorites," she said, smiling now, warm and conspiratorial, like we were two women trading a secret in a grocery store aisle. "Let's keep this between us." Behind the kitchen door, packed into the hallway shoulder to shoulder, silent as a held breath, was every person who mattered to me. My aunt, my uncle, my cousin, my stepsister. All of them crammed into 11 square feet of hallway, listening to a woman who thought she was alone with her stepson on the worst day she could imagine for him. I could hear the refrigerator humming behind me. I could hear faintly my uncle's shoe shifting on the hardwood in the hallway, a small creak he probably didn't notice himself making. The balloons Delilah had tied to the backs of the kitchen chairs that morning bobbed gently every time the front door's draft moved through the room, and I fixed my eyes on one of them, a plain silver number 1, because looking at Vivian directly felt like it might crack whatever composure I had left. She set her purse down on the counter beside the cake, unhurried, like she had all the time in the world, because as far as she knew, she did. 18 years had taught her that no matter what she said in this kitchen, I would absorb it, quietly, alone, the way I always had. Say something impossible, watch me carry it, and call the whole arrangement love. She had no idea what she'd just walked into. But to understand why I stood in that kitchen with my heart hammering and my voice perfectly level, you have to go back. You have to go back 18 years, to a woman who was never supposed to be anyone's mother, and a boy who never stood a chance. I was 12 years old when my father married Vivian Cross. My own mother had died of a brain aneurysm when I was 9, fast, no warning, gone on a Tuesday afternoon in the produce aisle of a Kroger in Beaver Creek, Ohio, while I sat in the car with a book on my lap. My father, Gerald, was 39 and drowning, and Vivian showed up at his office Christmas party in December of that same year, wearing red and laughing at every joke he made. 3 years later, they married in a backyard ceremony behind our house on Larchmont Avenue in Dayton, and Vivian moved in with her own daughter, Delilah, who was 6 at the time, 4 years younger than me. For the first year, it was almost fine. Vivian was attentive in public, complimentary of my grades, generous with things that cost money and nothing else. My grandmother, Eleanor Whitfield, my father's mother, never trusted her. She used to say Vivian had counting eyes, the kind of eyes that add up a room before she said hello to anyone in it. I didn't understand what that meant until much later. I understood it completely by the end. The first real crack came when I was 16. I had my driver's test scheduled for a Saturday morning in March, and the night before, I was so anxious I could barely eat. Vivian made tomato soup my favorite, and sat with me at the table while I choked it down between apologies for being dramatic. I remember the test itself in fragments. My hands wouldn't stop shaking. My vision kept sliding sideways, like the road was underwater. I failed for reckless operation of a vehicle, and the instructor wrote in his notes that I appeared to be under the influence of something, though a roadside test came back clean because nobody thought to test for anything beyond alcohol. At the time, everyone called it a panic attack. My father held me in the parking lot of the BMV and told me it happened to the best of people, that we'd try again in a month. Vivian stood a few feet back with her arms crossed, and I remember thinking she looked almost satisfied, though I told myself that was cruel of me to think, and pushed the thought away, the way you push away most things about a person you're not allowed to distrust out loud. That was the pattern that would define the next 17 years of my life. Something would happen to me. It would look from the outside like a personal failing, and Vivian would be standing nearby, arms crossed, watching. My grandmother Eleanor never softened toward her. At Thanksgiving in 2009, when I was 17, I overheard Eleanor telling my father in the kitchen that Vivian watches that boy like she's keeping score. My father laughed it off. He loved my grandmother, but he also loved his new wife, and a man drowning in grief 3 years earlier doesn't always trust his own mother's instincts over the woman who pulled him out of the water, even if the water was never as deep as he believed. My mother's name was Anne. I don't talk about her much in this story because this isn't really her story, but I want to say her name once, plainly, because she deserves that much. She was a high school art teacher at Beaver Creek High for 11 years. She used to leave notes in my lunch on Fridays, little cartoons of our cat with speech bubbles that said absurd, kind things. After she died, my father boxed up most of her belongings within 2 months, not out of cruelty, I understand now, but out of a grief so total he couldn't function in a house still full of her handwriting. Vivian was the one who helped him do it. She was, in that specific window of time, genuinely useful to a family that was drowning, and I think that's part of why it took me so long to see the rest of her clearly. People don't expect the hand that helps you up off the floor to also be the hand that put you there. The house on Larchmont had been my mother's before it was anyone else's. She'd picked the wallpaper in the downstairs bathroom, a pale yellow with small painted birds, and Vivian repainted it within her first 6 months living there, a plain, flat white, and told me when I asked why, that a house needs to breathe eventually, sweetheart. I was 12. I didn't have the vocabulary yet to understand that she wasn't talking about the house. By the time I was 14, Vivian had rearranged nearly every photograph in the house so that the ones of my mother were smaller, fewer, tucked into hallways instead of living rooms. My father either didn't notice or didn't have the strength to say anything about it. I noticed. I noticed everything. Even then, even before I had any reason to believe my noticing mattered. Delilah, for her part, adored me. She was the one good thing that came out of that marriage, as far as I was concerned. She used to follow me around the house asking to be taught guitar chords, and I taught her badly and patiently, and by the time she was 10, she could play half of a Fleetwood Mac song better than I could. She called me her real brother, not her stepbrother, and she meant it. I loved her the same way. Nothing that happened later ever touched that. If anything, it made it worse, because everything Vivian did to me, she did in front of a little girl who trusted her completely and had no way of knowing what she was witnessing. I remember one specific evening when Delilah was about 8 and I was 14, when she fell off her bike in the driveway and split her knee open on the pavement. Vivian was inside on a phone call and didn't hear her crying. I was the one who carried her in, cleaned the wound, found the bandages, sat with her on the bathroom counter until she stopped shaking. When Vivian finally came off the phone and saw the two of us there, she didn't thank me. She looked at the bandage wrapper in the trash, then at me and said lightly, almost playfully, "Look at you playing doctor. Bet that makes you feel important." I didn't understand until years later that even a kindness witnessed by her became something she needed to shrink back down to a smaller, uglier size, because a version of me that was simply good at taking care of people didn't fit the story she needed everyone else to believe. By the time I was 19, in my second year of nursing school at Wright State University, I had my wisdom teeth removed. It was routine. The oral surgeon, a man named Dr. Feldkamp, who Vivian had personally recommended and driven me to see, told my father afterward that there had been some minor nerve irritation during the extraction and that I might experience lingering discomfort. The lingering discomfort lasted 4 years. I was in genuine, documented pain, the kind that made it hard to sleep, hard to sit through a full shift of clinical rotations, hard to be a functioning 20-year-old. A different oral surgeon I saw years later, after everything came apart, told me the nerve damage in my jaw looked less like an accident and more like something done on purpose, a phrase he used almost as a passing observation, the kind of thing a professional says without meaning to hand you the first thread of a much larger rope. I started on prescription painkillers at 20. I was on them, on and off, dependent in ways I didn't have language for yet. By 22, my grades at Wright State slipped from a 3.7 to a 2.1 in the span of 3 semesters, and I nearly withdrew from the nursing program entirely before a professor named Dr. Halloran pulled me aside after a clinical rotation and told me, bluntly, that she'd seen this exact trajectory in a dozen students before me and that I still had time to turn it around if I got real help immediately. My father worried. My grandmother worried more and paid for my first stint in an outpatient program herself. $6,000 she never once mentioned again, quietly transferred from an account she kept separate from anything Vivian could access, a detail I didn't understand the significance of until years later. And Vivian, every single time, was the first to comfort me after a relapse, the first to bring soup, the first to sit with me on the bathroom floor at 2 in the morning telling me it wasn't my fault, that addiction was a disease, that she understood better than anyone. I believed her. God help me, for over a decade I believed her. The escalation didn't happen all at once. It happened the way water erodes stone, one small and reasonable-looking event at a time, each one just plausible enough that objecting to it would have made me look paranoid, or worse, ungrateful. The first real ceiling came when I was 23. I'd been sober 4 months, the longest stretch I'd managed since I started using, and I was proud of it in the quiet, guarded way you're proud of something you're terrified to jinx. Vivian started hosting Sunday dinners again, family style, everyone at the table, and she'd bring out protein shakes she said she'd started making for the whole family's health, lightly sweetened, vanilla, in mason jars with little chalkboard labels. I drank mine every week for 2 months. My hands started shaking again in week 5. My speech slurred at a dinner in front of my father and Delilah in week 7. And I remember Vivian's face, the way she reached for my arm with such visible, tender concern while she said, loud enough for the table, "Oh, sweetheart, not again." And I wanted to disappear into the floor. I asked, reasonably, whether something in the house could be affecting me. I asked my father directly if Vivian might be putting something in the food. And I want to be honest with you, I asked it like a man who already knew how insane it sounded. My father's face did something complicated and pained, something between grief and disappointment, and he told me gently that blaming Vivian for my own struggles wasn't fair, that she'd done nothing but try to help me, that maybe it was time I considered a longer inpatient program. I agreed. I felt ashamed for having asked. I went to a 28-day program in Columbus that April, paid for again by my grandmother, and I came home believing the problem had been entirely, exclusively me. The second ceiling came 2 years later, when I was 25, newly licensed as a registered nurse, working nights in the medical surgical unit at Miami Valley Hospital. It was the job I'd wanted since I was 12 years old, since the year my mother died, and a hospice nurse named Carol sat with me in a hallway and let me cry without telling me to stop. I'd been sober 11 months. I was building a life. And then, on a Tuesday in October, Vivian called me sobbing, saying my father needed to talk to me about something serious. And when I arrived at the house, 2 police officers were standing in the living room, and Vivian had a fresh, dark bruise blooming under her left eye. She told them I'd hit her during an argument about money. I hadn't been anywhere near that house in 4 days, but she was crying, genuinely, convincingly, and I was a nurse with a documented history of substance dependency, and my own father stood in the corner of that living room and did not once look at me. I was arrested, released the same night on bond my grandmother posted, and though the charges were eventually dropped for lack of evidence 3 months later, the damage was already permanent. My nursing license was suspended pending investigation. Miami Valley Hospital terminated my employment the following week. Citation, conduct unbecoming, pending legal matter. I never practiced nursing again. I was 25 years old, and the only career I had ever wanted was over. And Vivian sat beside me at my grandmother's kitchen table 2 weeks later, squeezing my hand, telling me she believed in me, that she knew I'd land on my feet. I want you to notice something, because I noticed it too, eventually, far too late. Every single time something was taken from me, Vivian was the person standing closest, offering comfort. It is a very specific kind of cruelty, engineering someone's collapse, and then becoming their only soft place to fall. It teaches you to need the very person destroying you. It took me until I was 33 years old to understand that this wasn't an accident of timing. It was the entire design. The night I lost my job at Miami Valley Hospital, I sat in my car in the parking garage for 2 hours before I could make myself drive home, because I didn't have a home that felt safe to drive to anymore. When I finally walked in, Vivian had made up the guest room for me. Fresh sheets, a glass of water on the nightstand, and she sat on the edge of the bed and told me, in the softest voice I'd ever heard her use, that she'd always known hospitals weren't ready for someone with my history, that the world could be cruel to people who were trying to change, that I should never be ashamed of who I used to be. I cried in front of her that night the way I hadn't cried in front of anyone since my mother died. I thanked her. I actually thanked her for comfort that existed only because she had manufactured the wound it was treating. The third ceiling came when I was 27. My grandmother Eleanor, 79 years old and sharp as a blade her whole life, began declining fast in the spring, some combination of a small stroke and the beginning of vascular dementia that the doctors were still trying to name. Vivian, unprompted, offered to move into Eleanor's condo in Kettering to help manage things, and my father, exhausted and grateful, agreed. I visited twice a week, usually on Tuesday and Saturday mornings, bringing her the crossword from the Dayton Daily News because she refused to do the ones the assisted living activity coordinator handed out, calling them written for children. I noticed my grandmother seemed foggier after Vivian's visits than after mine, her sentences trailing off mid-thought in a way they never did with me, though I told myself that was the disease progressing on its own, not a pattern anyone was orchestrating. In August of that year, 6 weeks before my grandmother died, she signed a new will at a lawyer's office Vivian had selected, leaving the bulk of her $420,000 estate to a trust for the benefit of the family, with Vivian named as sole trustee. The will noted, in language I didn't understand until I read it again years later, that Eleanor had expressed significant and documented concern about my history of substance abuse and did not wish her assets to be misused. I found out about the will after the funeral. I never contested it. I didn't have the strength, and everyone around me gently told me it wasn't the time. I remember standing at her graveside in October in a cemetery off Wilmington Pike, thinking that the last real conversation I'd had with her 3 days before she signed that will had been about nothing more important than a crossword clue neither of us could solve, and that if I had known it would be one of our last, I would have asked her something that actually mattered. The fourth sealing came 18 months after that, when I was 29. My father had a heart attack in his sleep on a Thursday night in November, 66 years old. No prior diagnosis. Dead before the ambulance reached Larchmont Avenue. I found out I was the one who'd been with him that evening, the last person to see him alive at a coffee they'd had together at 9 o'clock, and for the rest of my life I would carry the story Vivian told everyone at the funeral, that my father had gone to bed troubled that night, worried sick because I'd called him high, asking for money, and that he'd died with that worry sitting on his chest. I didn't call him. I didn't ask him for money. I have never once, in the 11 years since, been able to fully silence the small, poisoned voice that wonders if some part of what she said was true, because grief doesn't leave room for cross-examination. It just leaves you holding whatever story arrived first. And the fifth ceiling, the one that finally, quietly, planted the first real seed of doubt I couldn't uproot, involved my dog. His name was Scout. He was a black Labrador my grandmother had actually given me before she got sick, trained through a program in Cincinnati as a psychiatric service dog after my third relapse, when my therapist suggested I needed something that could interrupt a spiral before it started. Scout slept at the foot of my bed for 6 years. He woke me from nightmares. He put his whole heavy body against my legs when my hands started shaking in public. He was, without exaggeration, the reason I made it through the 2 years after my father's death without using again. He died 3 years ago when I was 31, on a night I don't remember clearly, which is itself the entire horror of the thing. I woke up on my kitchen floor at 6 in the morning with Scout's body cold beside me and no memory of the night before. My tox screen at the emergency room came back positive for benzodiazepines I had no prescription for and swore I hadn't taken. The emergency vet who examined Scout's body, at my request, noted signs consistent with sedative toxicity, but the case was closed within a week. Ruled accidental, most likely something Scout had gotten into to himself, maybe table scraps laced with something I'd dropped during a blackout. Everyone, including me, accepted that story, because the alternative story, the one where someone came into my home and killed my dog and drugged me to make sure I woke up thinking I'd done it myself, was too monstrous to hold in my hands. I buried Scout in my grandmother's old backyard, the one Vivienne still owned, under a maple tree, and I did not use again after that night. Not once, though God knows I wanted to. If anything, it was the moment the shape of my life quietly turned. I got sober for real that week, not for my father, not for anyone else, but because I understood, in some wordless animal way, that if I kept going the way I was going, I would lose everything else I had left too. There was a sixth ceiling too, smaller than the others, but it's the one that used to keep me up at night more than almost any of it, because it cost me something that had nothing to do with pills or blackouts. When I was 30, a year before Scout died, I was seeing a woman named Priya, a physical therapist I'd met at a recovery meeting she attended for her own reasons, and for 8 months it was the first relationship I'd had that felt like it might actually hold. Vivienne met her exactly twice. The second time, at a birthday dinner for Delilah, Vivienne pulled Priya aside in the kitchen, woman to woman, and told her, gently, tearfully, that she was only sharing this because she loved me and worried for anyone who got close to me, that I had a pattern of becoming controlling and unstable when I felt threatened, that she herself had once needed a restraining order years earlier during a bad stretch, a restraining order that had, in fact, never existed. Priya ended things 2 weeks later. She wouldn't tell me why at the time. She told me once, years afterward, in a single short email after she'd heard what happened at the party, that she was sorry, that she should have trusted her own read of me over a stranger's tears in a kitchen. I don't blame her. I understand completely. Vivienne was, above almost everything else she ever did to me, extraordinarily good at making herself believable. Quick pause from the story. If you enjoy these stories, consider taking a listen to our Spotify show linked in the description for early access to new stories in better audio quality. Now back to the video. The thing that finally cracked it all open didn't come from me. It came from my cousin Vincent, Aunt Rosalind's son, who'd become an emergency room nurse himself at Grandview Medical Center, and who'd spent 2 years quietly, patiently, worrying about me from a distance, the way people do when they love someone but don't yet have evidence to justify saying anything out loud. It was February 14 months ago. I was 10 months sober at that point, rebuilding slowly, working as a medical scribe since my nursing license would never be reinstated, living alone in a small rental on the east side of Dayton, with a new rescue dog named Otis, who wasn't a service animal but who tried his best anyway. Vincent came over one night with a 6-pack of the alcohol-free beer he always brought out of some instinct for solidarity, and somewhere around his second bottle, he asked me carefully whether I still had any of the paperwork from Scout's death. I did. I'd kept everything. The emergency vet report, my own hospital discharge papers, all of it shoved in a folder I hadn't opened in 3 years because opening it felt like reopening a wound that had only just started to close. Vincent read through the vet's necropsy notes with a clinical, focused expression I recognized from every doctor I'd ever watched deliver bad news, and then he looked up at me and said, "Caleb, this benzodiazepine level in Scout's blood work, this isn't table scraps. This is a calculated dose. Somebody who knew exactly how much a 70-pound dog could take before it stopped his heart." I sat very still. I told him he was reaching. That plenty of things could explain a high toxicology reading. That I didn't want to go down this road again. That the last time I let myself suspect Vivienne of something, it cost me my career and my father's trust, and I wasn't sure I had anything left to lose that she hadn't already taken. Vincent didn't push that night, but 2 weeks later he came back with something else. A printout of a pharmacy record he'd pulled, with the reluctant help of a friend who worked compliance at a CVS in Kettering, showing that a customer named Vivienne Whitfield had filled a prescription for diphenhydramine, and separately for a controlled sedative under a doctor named Feldkamp, the exact same oral surgeon who had operated on my jaw 11 years earlier, 3 days before Scout died. I remembered, suddenly and completely, a detail I had buried so deep I'd nearly convinced myself I imagined it. A receipt I'd found in Vivienne's car 8 years earlier, back when I was still naive enough to be helping her carry groceries in from a Costco run, a receipt for a case of Benadryl she laughed off as being for Delilah's allergies, even though Delilah had never had an allergy in her life. I'd noticed it. I'd felt the small, wrong shiver of noticing it, and then I'd folded it up and put it away, because the story it suggested was too large and too ugly to hold, and because I had spent my entire life being taught, gently and repeatedly, by nearly everyone around me, that my instincts about this particular woman could not be trusted. Once Vincent said it out loud, once someone else's voice carried the same suspicion mine had been too frightened to speak, I couldn't unhear it. We spent the next several months, quietly, carefully, pulling threads. Vincent, through channels I never fully asked about, got a colleague to review the old assault case file from when I was 25. The original police report noted, almost as an aside, that Vivienne had declined a follow-up medical exam to document the bruise's age, a detail that had never gone anywhere because nobody had been looking for it. My Aunt Rosalind, once we finally told her what we suspected, remembered Eleanor's will being changed 6 weeks before her death, and remembered too a conversation with Eleanor in the hospital, where my grandmother, foggy but lucid in bursts, had said something about not trusting the soup Vivienne kept bringing, a comment the family had written off at the time as dementia-driven paranoia. None of it on its own was proof of anything. All of it together was a shape. And the shape had a face, and the face was smiling at every family dinner, holding my hand at every low point, telling me for 18 years that she was the only person who truly understood what I was going through. Vincent, being the most methodical methodical person in our family by a wide margin, kept a private spreadsheet which he showed me only once at his kitchen table on a night I still think about often. It had a column for each incident, a column for the earliest date I remembered symptoms beginning, and a column cross-referencing Vivian's known location or documented purchases in the weeks prior. He never once used the word pattern out loud that night. He didn't have to. The spreadsheet said it for him. 11 rows long, spanning 18 years, and looking at it laid out in a plain sans serif font on his laptop screen was somehow more devastating than hearing any single piece of it individually. I remember putting my head down on his kitchen table and staying there for a long time while he sat with a hand on my back and said nothing at all because there was nothing useful left to say. We told my Aunt Rosalind first in March, 6 weeks before the party, over coffee at a diner off Woodman Avenue, where we could be reasonably sure no one who knew Vivian would overhear us. Rosalind is a careful woman, not easily rattled, a retired paralegal who spent 30 years learning not to react to things out loud, and even she had to set her coffee cup down twice during that conversation because her hands weren't steady enough to hold it. She was the one who suggested Theodore should be the one holding a phone that day, because Theodore, in her words, doesn't panic and doesn't blink. She was also the one who insisted, gently but firmly, that we bring in her old colleague, a family law attorney named Priscilla Adeyemi, before we did anything else, so that whatever we gathered would actually be usable somewhere beyond our own certainty. Delilah was the hardest conversation, and the one we put off the longest. We told her in April, 10 days before the party, in Vincent's living room, with Rosalind sitting beside her the entire time. I watched my stepsister's face move through every stage of a grief she hadn't been allowed to have yet. Disbelief first, then a kind of frantic bargaining, listing reasons it couldn't be true, and then, finally, a stillness that frightened me more than the tears that came after it. She asked to see the pharmacy printout herself. She read it twice. Then she asked in a very small voice whether she should still come to the party at all, and I told her the truth, that I needed her there, that whatever happened, I didn't want to be the only person in that kitchen who already knew. My 1-year sober anniversary was coming up in April. I decided, with Vincent, with Rosalind, with my Uncle Theodore, and eventually with Delilah, who we brought in last and most carefully, because we didn't yet know how much of this she could survive hearing about her own mother, that we would use it, not to trap her exactly. I want to be precise about this because it matters to me that this story is told honestly. We didn't plant anything. We didn't coach her into a confession. We simply invited her to a celebration, the way you'd invite anyone. On the one occasion where, historically, she had never once been able to resist reminding me how fragile she believed my sobriety to be. We asked the rest of the family to arrive early and wait in the hallway off the kitchen, out of sight, in case she said anything worth hearing. Theodore brought his phone, fully charged, camera app already open. None of us knew, walking into that afternoon, whether anything would happen at all. We only knew that if it did, we would not be the only ones who heard it this time. So there we were, Vivian with the pill bottle rattling in her hand, smiling at me like we were sharing a secret over her cake comment. I looked at that bottle and felt 18 years of my life rearrange itself in front of me, and I made a decision that took less than a second and felt somehow like the longest decision of my life. I decided to let her talk. Wow, I said, keeping my voice light, almost admiring. Dad would be so proud of the woman he married. Her smile twisted just slightly, the mask slipping the way it always did when she thought no one but me could see it. Your father? She said. That sack of guilt worried about his junkie son. Because of me? I asked. She laughed, cold and sharp, and popped a pill from the bottle like it was a breath mint, tossing it back with a small theatrical flourish. You still don't get it, do you? I didn't say anything. I let the silence do the work silence always does with people like Vivian, who cannot stand to leave a room without having the last, most impressive word in it. Remember your driving test panic attack at 16? She said. I crushed an oxy into your tomato soup. Your first taste, courtesy of Stepmommy. My stomach dropped even though I already knew, even though Vincent and I had spent a year building toward exactly this confirmation, because there is a difference between suspecting something in your bones and hearing it said out loud in your own kitchen by the person who did it to you. I kept my voice steady. I had practiced this, in the mirror, more times than I want to admit. The chronic pain after my wisdom teeth, I said. My cousin nicked the nerve on purpose, she said, almost proud of it, the way you describe a clever bit of home renovation. Kept you hooked and desperate. The relapses, I said. Every time I got clean. Xanax in your protein shakes, she said. Crushed pills at every family dinner. You'd slur your words and everyone believed I was the one holding this family together. She said it the way you'd describe a recipe you were proud of, a little smile tugging at the corner of her mouth. Your grandmother signed her whole estate over to me 2 weeks before she died because she was terrified of you wasting it on drugs. My chest went cold in a way that had nothing to do with temperature. You killed her, I said. I expedited things, she said, and I watched the word land in the air between us like something physical. Same as your father. He died thinking you chose drugs over saying goodbye to him one last time. 3 crushed oxys in your coffee that night. Rage climbed up my throat like something alive, something with claws, and I let it climb and I did not let it out. I thought about Vincent standing in that hallway. I thought about Rosalind holding her breath 11 feet away. I thought about every year I had spent believing I was the villain of my own story, and I kept my voice level, because level was the only weapon I had left that could actually hurt her. The assault charge that ended my nursing career, I said. That was you too? I hit myself with a door handle until I had a gorgeous black eye, she said, and called the police screaming you'd attacked me. Clever, wasn't it? No hospital would ever hire you after that. The hepatitis diagnosis, I said, because I hadn't told anyone but Vincent that I'd started asking about that too. A diagnosis I'd received at 26 6 with no clear source, one more mark against me that I'd folded quietly into the story of a life that seemed determined to fall apart on its own. One dirty needle pulled from the clinic's medical waste while you were passed out, she said, almost bored now, checking her own nails. You never even felt it, Priya, I said. Just her name, nothing else, to see if Vivian would even remember it. She smiled, actually smiled. A small private smile like I'd handed her a compliment. That sweet little physical therapist? I told her the truth, that you get controlling, unstable. I even cried a little. Girls like that always believe a mother's tears. She shrugged one shoulder, elegant, dismissive. You were getting too happy, too stable. I couldn't have that. I filed that answer away with the rest of them. A small, quiet confirmation of something I'd suspected for 2 years and never had the nerve to ask her about directly. And I understood in that moment that there had never been a single good year of my adult life she hadn't found some way to reach into. And then she looked past me, at my keys hanging on the hook by the door, at Scout's old collar tag still clipped to the ring because I'd never been able to make myself take it off, and something in her eyes went soft in the worst way I've ever seen a human face go soft. Want to hear something funny about your precious service dog? She said. Benadryl in his food, sleeping pills in your drink. I strangled him myself and laid him next to you. You buried him thinking you did it in a blackout. The rage in my throat stopped being an idea and became a living thing with a pulse of its own. I thought of 6 years of that dog's weight against my legs at 2 in the morning. I thought of digging his grave under my grandmother's maple tree with my own hands, sobbing, certain I had killed the one creature who had never once failed me. Why? I said, and my voice cracked for the first time all afternoon. The first crack I let her see. Why do all of this to me? She slammed the bottle down on the counter, and for the first time that day, the mask came all the way off. Because you existed, she said. Every time your father chose you over me, every dollar spent on your therapy instead of our vacations, you were proof I was his second choice. Look at you now. Even sober, you're ruined. Permanently. That was the sentence that ended it. Not because it was worse than anything else she'd said, but because it was the truest thing she'd said all afternoon. The closest she'd ever come to admitting, out loud, that none of it had ever been about me at all. It was about a woman who could not stand to be second in anyone's life, who had found a 12-year-old boy grieving his mother, and decided at some point I will never fully understand that his existence was a debt she intended to collect for the rest of his life. That's when something crashed upstairs. Delilah stood frozen at the top of the staircase, the anniversary banner pole clattering down the steps behind her, a length of blue ribbon trailing after it like something wounded. She hadn't been in the hallway with the others. She'd been upstairs finishing a sign she'd insisted on making herself, and she'd come down at exactly the wrong, exactly right moment, and there was no version of her mother's face in that instant that could be explained away as a misunderstanding. Behind her, my whole family spilled out of the hallway. Faces drained the color of the wall behind them. My Aunt Rosalind moved first, stepping between Vivian and the front door with the particular calm of a woman who had spent months preparing for a moment she still hoped, right up until it arrived, would never actually happen. My Uncle Theodore already had his phone raised, the little red recording icon blinking in the corner of the screen, his hand steadier than I would have believed possible. My cousin Vincent positioned himself at the kitchen's back exit, arms crossed, saying nothing, needing to say nothing. Vivian's face went through an entire lifetime of expressions in under 2 seconds. Smug to confused to something close to terror, the particular terror of a person realizing all at once that the room she thought was empty had been full the entire time. I grabbed a dish towel from the oven handle and wrapped it carefully around the pill bottle on the counter, some instinct from every crime procedural I'd ever half-watched telling me not to smudge whatever was still on it. My hand was shaking as I dialed 911, but my voice when the dispatcher answered came out clear. I need police for attempted distribution of controlled substances, I said. Multiple witnesses. The address is 4417 Larchmont Avenue. Vivian started screaming before I'd even finished giving the address. She said I was lying, that I was setting her up, that her junkie stepson had been trying to frame her for years because he was jealous of everything she'd built with my father. Theodore kept the camera rolling through all of it, calm and silent, documenting a performance that was, for the first time in 18 years, being witnessed by people who already knew the ending. Delilah collapsed onto the stairs, sobbing in a way that didn't sound like a 19-year-old anymore, sounded instead like something much younger, something that had just watched its entire understanding of its own mother collapse in real time. Rosalind went to her immediately, wrapping an arm around her, keeping her close but visible to the rest of us, the way you'd hold someone at the edge of a crowd during an emergency, present but not exposed. Nobody left the kitchen. Nobody let Vivian anywhere near the door, not out of any coordinated plan, just out of the simple, wordless agreement of people who had all, independently, decided that this particular story was not going to end with her walking away from it clean. Officers arrived within 15 minutes, 2 patrol cars pulling up outside a house that 20 minutes earlier had smelled like vanilla frosting and looked like the setting for the most ordinary kind of family celebration. I handed over the towel-wrapped bottle and gave my statement in the driveway while Vivian's voice carried from the kitchen, swinging wildly between sobbing and screaming, insisting to a second officer that none of it was true, that her stepson had a documented history of substance abuse and could not be trusted, that this was some kind of elaborate revenge scheme cooked up by a family that had never forgiven her for marrying into it. They separated us into different rooms of the house to take statements, standard procedure, and through the wall between the living room and the dining room, I could hear the shape of her voice without the words, rising and falling. A woman fighting for a version of reality body that had just permanently stopped being available to her. When my own statement was finished, close to an hour later, the responding sergeant told me that between the physical evidence, the recorded audio and video, and the number of corroborating witnesses in the house, they had enough to request an emergency protective order on the spot, effective immediately, pending a full investigation into the assault charge from 8 years earlier, the circumstances surrounding my father's and grandmother's deaths, and the death of my dog. My hands were shaking so badly by the time they handed me the paperwork that I had to try twice to get my signature to land inside the box. I watched through the front window as 2 officers walked Vivian out of my kitchen in handcuffs, served her the protective order on the porch steps, and guided her into the back of a cruiser. Her mascara had run in long, dark lines down both cheeks. She was still screaming my name as the door closed, the sound muffled and strange through the glass, like something from very far away instead of 30 feet in front of me. Delilah wouldn't look at any of us for a long time after the cars pulled away. She sat on the bottom step with her knees pulled up to her chest, staring at the spot on the counter where the pill bottle had been, and I understood, watching her, that she wasn't just grieving the afternoon. She was grieving 18 years of a mother she had loved without reservation, a mother she was now going to have to learn how to remember all over again, this time with the truth folded into every good memory she thought she had. The investigation took 11 months. I want to tell you it moved quickly, that justice arrived clean and fast the way it does in the version of this story I used to imagine telling someday, but that isn't how any of it actually went. Vivian's public defender argued at every stage that the recording was inadmissible, that the confession had been coerced by a hostile family ambush, that a woman under emotional distress at a party for her troubled stepson could not be held fully accountable for hyperbolic statements made in the heat of an argument. For a while I lay awake most nights convinced this argument might actually work, that 18 years of careful patient cruelty could be reduced, in a courtroom, to a single bad afternoon that a jury might decide to forgive. It didn't work in the end, though not for any reason as clean as justice simply prevailing. It didn't work because Vincent's pharmacy records held up under subpoena, and because a forensic accountant hired by my Aunt Rosalind, using money Theodore quietly pulled from their own retirement savings without being asked, traced 11 years of prescriptions filled under 3 different doctors, 2 of whom, including Dr. Feldkamp, agreed to cooperate rather than face charges of their own for writing scripts they should never have written. It didn't work because Eleanor's estate attorney, once shown the pattern, reopened the file on my grandmother's final will and found irregularities in the witnessing that a judge agreed warranted a full evidentiary hearing. It didn't work because my father's death, initially ruled natural causes, was reopened for a toxicology review that, 11 years too late to matter to him but not too late to matter to the rest of us, came back consistent with what Vivian had described in my kitchen. The estate case alone took most of a year and cost more in legal fees than the $420,000 it eventually recovered, money that was ultimately split, per a mediated settlement, between me, Delilah, and a scholarship fund Rosalind insisted on creating in Eleanor's name at Wright State's nursing program, a detail that felt, when we finalized it, like the only genuinely correct thing to come out of any of it. I didn't fight for a larger share than Delilah's. I want to be honest about why, not because I'm a better person than I sometimes get credit for in these stories, but because giving Delilah half felt like the only apology I was capable of offering her for a childhood she didn't choose either. There were other complications, the unglamorous kind that never make it into the version of a story people tell out loud, the kind that just eat months of your life in small, exhausting increments. My father's life insurance policy, a $200,000 term policy through his employer, had named Vivian as sole beneficiary in a change filed 4 months before he died, a change I hadn't known existed until the estate attorney found it. Contesting it meant proving undue influence to an insurance company's internal review board, a process that took 9 months and required me to sit for 2 separate depositions describing, in clinical, unemotional detail, the worst days of my father's life and mine. The policy was eventually split between Delilah and me as well, half of it, after a settlement, going to cover the legal fees we'd both racked up along the way. Priscilla, Rosalind's attorney friend, waived a portion of her own fee once she understood the full shape of what we were dealing with, which is a kindness I don't think I've properly thanked her for, not in words that would do it justice. The house on Larchmont sat empty for 4 months while ownership worked its way through probate, since Vivian's name was still on the deed alongside my father's. I drove past it more than I want to admit during those months, at odd hours, unable to make myself go inside, unable to stop myself from checking that it was still standing, still ordinary looking from the street, still just a house instead of the crime scene it had quietly been for most of my life. Delilah went inside exactly once during that period to collect a box of childhood photographs she wanted before the estate sale, and she asked me to come with her, and we spent 40 minutes standing in that kitchen together, not speaking, just standing, the way you stand at a grave you visited enough times that you've run out of new things to say to it. Priya, the woman I dated years earlier, reached out again that summer, not to reconcile, she was clear about that, but simply to say she believed me now, fully, and to apologize for the 2 weeks she'd spent doubting her own instincts about who I actually was. It didn't undo anything, it wasn't supposed to, but I sat with that email for a long time, and it helped in a way I hadn't expected. The way it helps to have even one more person on record saying out loud that the version of me Vivian had spent years constructing was never the real one. The hardest part of that year, though, wasn't legal or financial. It was watching Delilah try to hold 2 completely contradictory truths in her body at once, that her mother had genuinely, tenderly loved her, and that the same same woman had spent nearly 2 decades destroying someone else Delilah loved just as much. She stopped eating properly for a while that spring. She started therapy the same week I called Vincent about Scout's paperwork, though neither of us knew it at the time. Rosalind and Theodore essentially absorbed her into their household during the worst of it. No formal conversation about it, just an extra plate at dinner every night until it wasn't a question anymore. And I have never seen two people extend that kind of quiet, unconditional cover to someone who wasn't technically their own child. And I don't think I'll ever be able to repay it, and I don't think they'd want me to try. Delilah moved out of the Larchmont house within a month, first to Rosalind's spare bedroom, and then, by the following fall, into her own apartment near the University of Dayton, where she was finishing a psychology degree she'd once planned to abandon, and now, for reasons she has never fully explained to me but that I understand completely, refused to give up. She still calls me her brother. She has never once in the year and a half since that afternoon called me her stepbrother, and I have never corrected her. There were nights during that year I sat in my car outside the county jail, not visiting, just sitting, trying to understand what I was even supposed to feel. Rage came easily. Grief was harder and stranger, because I found myself grieving a woman who had spent 18 years methodically destroying my life, grieving not her, but the version of her I'd needed to believe in as a 12-year-old boy who had just lost his mother and desperately wanted someone, anyone, to be safe. That grief doesn't cancel out the rage. It just sits beside it, an uninvited passenger you learn to drive around. Vivian pled guilty eventually to a reduced set of charges tied to the assault case, the attempted distribution charge from the party, and financial exploitation of a vulnerable adult connected to Eleanor's estate. The prosecutor could not, in the end, secure homicide charges for either my father's or my grandmother's deaths. The evidence, 11 years old in one case and closer to a decade in the other, was described in the plea hearing as strongly suggestive but not conclusive beyond reasonable doubt, a sentence I have read so many times since that I could probably recite it in my sleep. She's serving 6 years. I try most days not to do the math on how much of that overlaps with the time I have left to have a life that doesn't orbit around her. Delilah went to see her mother once, in the county jail, 4 months after the arrest, against Rosalind's gentle advice and my own silence on the matter, because I didn't feel it was my place to tell her not to.
She came to my apartment straight afterward and sat on my kitchen floor with her back against the cabinets, the same way she used to sit when she was small, and wanted to be near me without being asked to talk. She told me her mother had cried through the entire visit, had said she loved her more than anything in the world, had never once mentioned my name or apologized for a single thing that had happened in that kitchen.
She still thinks she's the victim, Delilah said, staring at a spot on the floor. Even now, even after everything. She never went back. She told me later that the visit had actually helped, in a strange way, because it was the moment she finally stopped waiting for her mother to become someone capable of remorse. I sat in the second row of the courtroom on sentencing day, between Vincent and Rosalind, with Delilah on my other side gripping my hand so hard I had marks the next morning. Vivian read a statement she'd clearly rehearsed, describing herself as a devoted mother and stepmother who had made serious errors in judgment during a difficult marriage, a phrase so far from the truth that I heard Theodore exhale sharply behind me, the only sound he made through the entire hearing. She did not look at me once during her statement. She looked at the judge the whole time, the same performance she'd given every audience for 18 years, adjusted slightly for a room that this time wasn't buying it. The judge, a woman named Constance Aubrey, who had clearly read every page of the file, said before handing down the sentence that she had rarely seen a pattern of sustained, deliberate harm disguised so effectively as devotion. And I have thought about that sentence more times than almost anything else anyone has ever said about my life. Vincent's spreadsheet, the one he'd shown me that night at his kitchen table, ended up as Exhibit 14 in the prosecutor's file, printed out and bound and handed to a jury pool that, in the end, never had to deliberate because Vivian took the plea 2 days before trial was set to begin. He never told me how it felt to watch something he'd built quietly, out of worry and love and 18 months of careful weekend research, become the backbone of a case that finally held her accountable. I didn't ask. Some things you just let a person keep for themselves. I'm 34 now. I live alone still in the same small rental on the east side of Dayton, with Otis, who has gotten old enough that his muzzle has started going gray, and who sleeps at the foot of my bed in a spot that I know, without ever having said it out loud to him, he inherited from a dog he never met. I never went back to nursing, not formally, though I did use the settlement money to finish a certification as a peer recovery coach, and I now work 3 days a week at an outpatient clinic in Kettering, sitting with people on the worst days of their sobriety and telling them with more authority than I ever expected to have that the story their family tells about them is not always the true one. Sometimes it isn't even close. Dr. Halloran, the professor who once pulled me aside during clinicals, reached out after a mutual friend told her what had happened and wrote a letter to the state nursing board on my behalf, arguing that the original suspension had been built on evidence that no longer held up. The board hasn't reinstated my license and may never, but the letter sits framed on my wall now anyway, not as proof of anything official, just as a reminder that someone who watched me at my worst never once believed the story Vivienne told about who I really was. Delilah and I have Sunday dinners now, just the two of us, at my apartment instead of the house on Larchmont, which sold last spring to a young couple who had no idea what had happened inside its kitchen and who, I hope, get to fill it with something better. She's graduating in the spring. She wants to work with kids who've grown up around addiction in their own families, and I think, though I've never said this to her directly, that she is going to be extraordinary at it, precisely because she understands from the inside how easily the story can be told wrong. I still have the vet's necropsy report in a folder in my desk drawer. I've never thrown it out. I keep it, I think, as evidence not for any court but for myself. On the days when the old shame tries to creep back in and whisper that maybe I really was the reason everything fell apart, that maybe I imagined more of it than actually happened. I don't need to open the folder often anymore. Most days I don't need it at all. People ask me sometimes, carefully, the way you ask a question you're not sure you're allowed to ask, whether I regret staging that party, whether I regret letting my family hide in a hallway to listen to a confession instead of confronting her privately, quietly, the first moment I suspected. I understand why they ask. It sounds on paper like something out of a television script, engineered and dramatic, but I didn't do it for drama. I did it because I had spent 18 years being the only witness to my own life, the only one in the room who knew what was actually happening, and every single time I tried to say so out loud, I was met with love, real love, that simply couldn't hold what I was telling it. I needed my family to hear it themselves. I needed for once not to be the only one carrying the truth alone in a room. There's a version of this story where I get to end it cleanly, where the confrontation in that kitchen felt like triumph and nothing else. But that isn't honest, and I promised myself a long time ago that if I ever told this story, I would tell it honestly. What I actually feel most days, standing in my own small kitchen making coffee for one, is something quieter and sadder than triumph. I lost a father who died believing a lie about the last night of his life. I lost a grandmother who spent her final months afraid of a soup that had nothing wrong with it and terrified in ways she couldn't articulate of something she could sense but not name. I lost 6 years with a dog who saved my life more times than I can count, and I lost 18 years I will never get back. Years I spent believing the person destroying me was the only one who understood me. I think about my father more now than I did in the years right after he died, which surprised me at first and doesn't anymore. Grief, I've learned, isn't actually linear, no matter how many pamphlets and recovery meetings insist that it is. I think about the coffee we had together the night he died, 9 o'clock, nothing special, just a father and his adult son at a kitchen table that used to belong to a woman neither of us talked about enough. I have to actively choose some nights to remember that coffee correctly, to hold on to the true version of it instead of the one Vivian handed the rest of the family at his funeral. Some nights I manage it, some nights I still don't. I think about my grandmother too, and the will she signed 6 weeks before she died, foggy and frightened, and trying in whatever clarity she had left to protect a family she could sense was in danger, even if she couldn't name the shape of it. I used to think she'd been fooled at the end. I don't think that anymore. I think some deep, uneroded part of her understood exactly what was happening around her, and did the only thing she still had the strength to do, which was hand her lawyer a name and hope someone eventually would follow the thread far enough to understand what she meant by it. It took 18 years and a dog's necropsy report for someone to follow it all the way. I like to think she'd forgive us the delay. I think too about the version of Eleanor who used to sit across from me at her kitchen table in Kettering, sharp-eyed even as the disease took more of her each month, saying things the rest of the family dismissed as confusion. "Watch the soup," she told me once, gripping my hand with more strength than I expected from someone so small by then. I laughed it off gently at the time, told her I would, the way you reassure someone whose mind you've already decided you can't fully trust anymore. I think about how much of my life might have gone differently if I had simply listened to her the first time, instead of needing 18 years in a courtroom to hear the same warning in a language I could finally understand. My 1-year sober anniversary is this weekend again, my second one now, though it doesn't carry quite the same weight as the first, the one where the whole shape of my life finally turned right side up in a kitchen full of family I didn't know was listening. Delilah is coming over, Vincent and Rosalind too. Theodore already asked if he should bring his phone, half joking, and I told him he could leave it in the car this time. There will be a cake, plain this time, nothing dramatic, just a name written in plain white icing and a number that means more to me than almost anything else in my life, and no one hiding anywhere in my apartment because there's finally nothing left that needs to be overheard. People in recovery talk a lot about rock bottom, about the single moment everything finally becomes clear enough to change. Mine wasn't the night Scout died, though I used to think it was. My real rock bottom was quieter than that, and it happened almost a year later, on an ordinary Tuesday, when I caught myself explaining to a coworker, casually, without even noticing I was doing it, that I probably deserved most of the bad things that had happened to me over the years, that I had a way of attracting chaos. I heard myself say it, and something in me went very still. That was Vivian's voice coming out of my mouth, fully absorbed, fully mine now too, and it terrified me more than any pill bottle ever had, because I understood, in that instant, that the most dangerous thing she'd ever done to me wasn't any single incident. It was teaching me to narrate my own life the way she needed it told. Some people build their whole recovery around the idea of getting your life back. I don't think that's quite what happened to me. I don't think I got my old life back at all. I think I finally, at 33 years old, standing in a kitchen with a pill bottle rattling in a stranger's purse, got to find out what my life actually was, underneath 18 years of someone else's careful, quiet design. It cost me almost everything to find that out. I'm still, most days, deciding whether it was worth the price. But I know at least that the story is finally mine to tell, in my own voice, in a room where no one has to hide in the hallway to hear the truth of it anymore.